The delivery of crucial aid to millions of struggling Afghans, a hot button at the United Nations. For a clearer picture of the humanitarian situation, we'll hear from the International Red Cross president coming up next. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We continue our show with the UN General Assembly. World leaders are gathering against the current backdrop of disastrous climate change, polarized world powers, as well as devastating pandemic, all worsened with a global divide among the rich and the poor. Alarms sounded over vaccine shortages and how the pandemic has threatened economic recovery and worsened inequality. Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged to offer more vaccines to nations in need for the rest of the year.
当务之急是要在全球范围内
Our pressing priority is to ensure the fair and equitable distribution of vaccines globally. China will strive to provide a total of 2 billion doses of vaccines to the world by the end of this year. In addition to donating $100 million to COVAX, China will donate 100 million doses of vaccines to other developing countries in the course of this year.
For the rest of the year, the actions for vaccines has to be as soon as possible. Earlier, I talked to Peter Maurer, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. As an observer at this year's UNGA, he shared his insights on China's vaccine contribution to the world and also other issues of humanitarian crisis in the world. Let's listen in. As you may know, the UN General Assembly is in meeting right now. Tell me more about you as an observer attending the meeting and also your discussions in bilateral meetings with countries all over the world. What are some of the latest information you can bring to us and messages?
War, conflict, violence in so many parts of the world. And therefore, the combination of all these problems is, of course, an issue of particular attention to us. I think the general impression that the world is at a tipping point, that the convergence of poverty, conflict, COVID, and climate change create an increasing number of people dependent on international humanitarian assistance or on assistance in general. And of course, unsurprisingly, leaders have different opinions on how to reverse this.
Mr. Maurer, as you may know, the Chinese president also delivered his part of the messages to the General Assembly of the UN. He's talking about that statesmen of today needs to answer some of the very crucial questions regarding the transition and regarding the challenges, like some of those that you mentioned earlier. How do you see the role of statesmen and whether that centennial question or centennial questions will be answered with confidence and the right resolve?
What the Chinese leader said is a broad reflection, so that many in the international community are looking for leadership, for orientation, for a perspective for the future, and for the question, how do we get out of the present challenges which affect so many million and hundreds of millions of people and marginalize and disenfranchise those people.
Right. Mr. Maurer, I know you and your team are dealing with the issue of crisis and the pandemic combined around the world. Now, on the issue of pandemic, how do you see the contribution of China in dealing with it through vaccines and contributions to developing countries in which your teams around the world are also working in?
I certainly appreciate a lot all leaders, including, of course, the Chinese leader, making generous offers with regard to the availability, production of vaccines, and making these vaccines available to those countries who cannot afford them at the present moment. This is an important step, and I think we have heard quite a number of leaders around the world recognizing that we are not sufficiently at scale with the production of vaccines and making these vaccines available to countries. If I look at the problems and from where we look at these challenges, in particular working with communities, working at the bottom of the pyramid, we of course encounter a lot of difficulties in implementing the application of vaccines, in particular in fragile contexts. I mentioned just a few. Sometimes there is resistance to vaccines and prejudice against vaccines. So my point is not to diminish the generosity of leaders' promises to work on the delivery of vaccine. I just wanted to highlight that from the production of vaccine, the availability of vaccine, to the chain till vaccine is applied in the last corner of the world and in the most remote and marginalized community, a lot of efforts have to be made, and that's where ICRC, Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is definitely working hard in order, as I often say, to deliver vaccine on the last mile, where it is really difficult and where we need to be able to have an impact.
Mr. Maurer, as you may know, and you also mentioned earlier, in some of the most unprivileged communities and the societies, there's a tremendous problem of inequality in the availability of vaccines, particularly to the developing countries and the least developed economies. How much is that a big challenge to your team when they're trying to do the humanitarian work on the ground?
Well, it is, of course, a huge problem because, as we know, that inequity and inequality are at the origin of so many conflicts and so much tension in society. And therefore, it is of critical importance to make vaccines available so that we diminish the gap between those who have easy access to vaccines and those who are much more challenged to have these accesses. So we do encounter not only reluctance to the vaccine as such, but we also encounter these tensions in society around the availability of vaccines. And very frankly, again, it's not only vaccines, it's availability of medical services, availability of health system, and access to health system which deliver basic health services to people. And so let's not fool ourselves, but the lack of access to health and broader to social systems is very often at the origin of so many tensions in society. And if we look at the drivers of conflict, at the drivers of violence, then very often we can set the origins where we have inequities, inequalities, and tensions in society because of lack of services to people.
Peter Maurer, president of ICRC. Over 3.5 million Afghans now are internal refugees and their ranks are growing. The United Nations warned recently thousands of people are scrambling to flee Afghanistan, even right now after Taliban seized control of the country almost 2 decades after they were ousted by a U.S.-led coalition and 20 years after U.S. occupation. Food and jobs are scarcer for many Afghans, forcing millions to seek refuge within and outside the nation's borders. More than $1 billion in aid were pledged at the recent UN donor conference in Geneva. President Peter Maurer of the International Committee of the Red Cross, just back from Afghanistan from his field trip, he shared with me his latest work on the ground. I want to move on, Mr. Maurer, to the issue of Afghanistan. Many of the things that you just mentioned, the problems and the challenges that this country specifically is facing right now. The UN General Assembly this year is also putting a focus on the country of Afghanistan. Mr. President, you just visited Afghanistan, and you also understand that there has been some contributions made by countries at the UN aid conference for Afghanistan. What do you make of the humanitarian efforts globally so far for that country?
Afghanistan is in a very specific situation because it doesn't have a broadly recognized government and international institutions coming to help the country, and therefore there has emerged a kind of consensus around the delivery of humanitarian assistance. I believe this is of critical importance in order to, as you rightly said, to service the Afghan people with the basic medical and other social services they need. At the same time, I see there is a lot of controversy on how to move from there. What is the best way forward? How to work with new authorities, how to work with the Afghan civil societies. What are conditions under which the international community feels comfortable working in Afghanistan? What are the security conditions, the inclusiveness conditions in the country? And I think this is a preoccupation that many actors have and have expressed either at the margin of the General Assembly this year or in bilateral contact.
What about the money that has been pledged to donate? How much do we know about the money being implemented?
The implementation is still a challenge because, of course, a lot of organization, a lot of people have left Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks. And therefore, projects which were undertaken before have come to a stop. The money pledged and the activities deployed at the present moment are still very modest. The International Committee of Red Cross has stayed in Afghanistan. Our workers are still all there. They have resumed work. They work with the Afghan Red Crescent Society in close cooperation. But a lot of actors have left, and therefore there is an objective gap now, which is difficult to assess. I don't think that at the present moment money is the main problem. The main problem is that there is discomfort with the general situation in Afghanistan, and I think it needs still a political push and also a push from economic institutions to see how they can cope with this new crisis situation where economic insecurity, political insecurity are about to create a major humanitarian concern for almost 40 million Afghans today.
You personally called on international organizations such as the World Bank to unfreeze the fund that belongs to the earlier Republic of Afghanistan to the people now in Afghanistan. How successful this has been, and what are the other things that do you think will be crucial to the funding of ICRC in terms of helping and supporting Afghanistan?
The World Bank will take its decision as other international organizations will take their decision.
As we know right now, this is a crisis that is in emergency. So if things are not being acted upon punctually and in time, things will get much worse than what it is now.
This is very much our assessment. It's obvious that when you travel through the country, when you look at problems, the problems are huge and demand a fast response. Can come from different quarters. It can come from multilateral institutions, it can come from bilateral donors. But I think responding to the humanitarian need, in particular health, water, sanitation, responding to the lack of finances to pay salaries to public officials and to hospital workers, hospitals and local administrations is a challenge with which the international community has to cope. And therefore, we are still at the very beginning of assessing what the real financial needs are and how to respond in the days and weeks to come to this emerging crisis situation, which I see at the horizon.
What about for ICRC? What is your plan?
You may have seen that as many other humanitarian organizations, we have considerably increased our budget line. We have spent in Afghanistan something like 587 million US Swiss francs in the last couple of years. We have increased to a budget line of 150 million. We see a keen interest of donors to support our activities also because we do have people on the ground with an ability to deliver, and we have strong partners in the Afghan Red Crescent Society, which is represented in all provinces, in all the parts, in all the cities of the country. And therefore, I'm very confident that if donors respond to a demand, that we are able to deliver fast, at least at the level of humanitarian assistance.
Right.
We will then still have other problems to deal with at the later stage.
Mr. Maurer, what about your team? How is it trying to deal with the current political and uncertainty in Afghanistan? As we know, the Taliban has put forward a so-called interim government, even though some of the international community members are not satisfied with the result because all of them are Taliban without other participation of political factions inside Afghanistan. So, Mr. President, so this brings another layer of uncertainty of what to happen and how international community will react to what's going on in Afghanistan. What does that mean for ICRC? What is your assessment about this?
We will need to engage at local level, at regional level, at national level to create conditions which allow us to have a big impact on the present situation. This needs a committed staff, it needs security also from the local, regional and national authorities in Afghanistan, and some of them, I think myself and other humanitarians who have visited over the last couple of days have received assurances. It will be important to translate these assurances into concrete action so that our colleagues in the field, at the front lines, the unrepresented colleagues feel safe and feel at ease.
The Taliban interim government, quote unquote, have already, in written form, submitted to the United Nations about trying to guarantee the security of personnel and also the supplies for humanitarian aid. Now, to ICRC, is that also being pledged by the Taliban interim government to your organization? How would you be able to guarantee the security of your team on the ground there?
I think Afghanistan, as everybody knows, has a complex reality, has different situations in different parts of the country, sees a very fragmented political landscape, and therefore it is important to be sure that some of these assurances materialize also in a neutral and impartial humanitarian space in which we can operate in different parts of the country. So it is logic that in a transformation and transformative phase as we are at the present moment, certain things are not clear, that there is insecurity, and therefore it is important to be there, to engage, to see how on a day-to-day basis we can negotiate those humanitarian spaces, therefore, and through that contribute to stabilize the situation, to give assurances by acts and not by words. That is true for our side as it is for Afghan institutions.
Mr. President, you were there in Afghanistan before the UN meeting, General Assembly meeting. What did you see? How were your team, together with you, negotiate on the daily basis, as you said earlier, that day when you were there? What were some of the impressions you have as a very seasoned humanitarian worker yourself? How do you see your team's best way forward, Mr. President?
First, I have to highlight that in all the projects I visited, in Kandahar, in Lashkargah, in Hanzi, in all the places where I visited humanitarian projects, many of the people who have been our interlocutors in the past are still our interlocutors at the present moment, even if the government has changed from the previous government to the Taliban government. Of course, we are now in a situation where new relations have to be built, and political assurances been established with respective authorities in the different cities and provinces of the country. We are ready to do this as we have done in many other places of the world, but this is definitely a focus of our activities at the present moment. We see new people coming in and we seek to build relations, to contact them.
Another issue very important about Afghanistan is not only the crisis we're facing, but also how different social groups within that country are being treated, whether they have equal and fair access to the same help, including the help given by ICRC. Mr. President, particularly these groups, people would be very much concerned about women, women's access to health, women's access to education, women's access to food. What do you make of the general realities now?
On the one side, services are delivered to need, and on the other side, our teams, our workers can work in an environment of diversity and of inclusion. Because if you want to have a credibility as an organization towards the society in which you operate, you have to reflect the multiplicity and diversity of the society in which you work. And therefore, I made it very clear also to our interlocutors the Taliban interlocutors in Kabul, that it is of critical importance that our teams and the teams of the Afghan Red Crescent are diversified teams, that men and women, Pashtun and Tajik and other ethnical orientations, attributions, that Sunni and Shia and people who have their origin in different regions of Afghanistan, that they all have their say and their stake, that they are stakeholders of a good humanitarian work that we develop. And I think this has been a challenge for quite some time in Afghanistan. It has been a challenge in the past, and it is a big challenge today.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.